I want to thank the Hunter College High School staff, the Alumnae Association. They've been wonderful in trying to get us together. The fact is that more than 100 people responded and want to attend, that this is a very important subject to them. Can I be heard? Is that okay? I want to welcome you. I want to thank you very much for your interest in this subject. It's almost like a mini reunion, which is very fine. We have 3 other panelists. One is from London. One is in Washington, D.C. And the other, like me, are from the Upper West Side.
Oh.
My connection to the Holocaust is that I was born in 1942 in Uzbekistan. My parents ran from Poland as soon as the Germans came in 1939. My grandma put together 2 troikas, took 2 uncles, her husband, my mommy and daddy. I hadn't been born yet, and we ran. And we ran south to where my grandfather was imprisoned for being a capitalist. We waited for his release and then continued in open cattle cars. We were told that we were able to, if we persisted, if we survived that trip, we were shot at, as I'm told, by Germans, that when we got there, we would get permission to go to Israel. And so that was our route to freedom. They were open cattle cars, they were shootings, there was lots of unpleasant stuff. When we got there, my grandfather became ill with typhus. I got typhus. There were no doctors. There were no antibiotics, but we survived. My grandmother didn't have very much to make dinners with, but always invited other people with. So my experience with the Holocaust has made a very, oh, by the way, we came to the United States in 1947 on the last voyage of the Ernie Pyle, a famous journalist. We got affidavits from my father's relatives. We were in a camp in Germany, displaced persons camps. They were very famous at the time. And we made it. And we made it when we got to the States. HCHS, the organization, helped us establish some work situations and whatever. And we grew, and we love America, at least in the 1950s. Now it's a little harder to love everything about America. But it was a wonderful thing that we were allowed to come here. We are very proud, loyal Americans. Let me now turn to someone who was born in Germany, and that is Eve. Her trips, her machinations before she was able to come here were very diverse, and I would love to hear them. Are you ready to tell us, Eve?
Thank you very much. I'm Eve KANNER Kugler, class of 1949. I was born in Halle, a medium-sized German city in 1931. We were a middle-class Jewish family. I had an older sister, Ruth, a year older than me, and my widowed grandfather, my father's father, also lived with us. I was 2 years old when Hitler came to power, and Jews were affected immediately because signs went up everywhere in our town, Jews forbidden. Soon, in 1933, the people in our city who were in power printed a list of all the Jewish lawyers and doctors and all the Jewish business people. And it was more than 100 people on the list, including my father, who owned a small department store, which was located on the street where we lived. His name was there, his address was there. And the list was headed, Germans, don't buy from Jews, don't give your money to Jews. It really just hit us there right in the beginning. Very soon thereafter, we children were not allowed to use the public skating rink anymore. We were not allowed to go to the cinema. There were Nazis everywhere in the street all the time. And sometimes they would march in the middle of the street. And if that happened, it was like a parade, and you had to stop and you had to raise your hand and you had to shout Heil Hitler. My mother was caught in one of those one day, and she had to force her arm up, mouth the words, because if she wasn't going to do that, she was going to be arrested. And indeed, more and more people were being arrested who were opposed to Hitler. In 1935, with the passage of the Nuremberg laws, which further limited the rights of the Jews, my parents had enough and decided that it was time to leave, and they applied for a visa, actually to the what was then known as Palestine, which became eventually the state of Israel. And our name was placed on a long waiting list, and when we got to the head of the list, we would be able to go. 1936, the year after we applied, we were still in Germany, still waiting. My younger sister, Leah, was born. She was born at home for the simple reason that Jews were no longer given any access to city hospitals. Fortunately, everything went well, but things were just
sorry to rush you, Eve. You're almost halfway through, my love.
Pardon?
You're almost halfway through the time we've allotted. So,
right. So we come to 1938, and the Nazis arrested my 78-year-old grandfather. 10 days later was Kristallnacht, when 6 Nazis burst into our home and arrested my father. The next morning, my mother was called downstairs. The windows of our store had been smashed, and she was forced to clean up the sidewalk until there was not a sliver of glass left. In the afternoon, we learned that our synagogue had been burned to the ground while the fire brigade watched. My mother then went to the police station and found out that my father was in the concentration camp of Buchenwald. If you get him a visa, he can get out because we don't want Jews in Germany. She found a forger who produced a visa for France. My father came home and very quickly left for France. It took my mother then another 6 months to find a visa for us to be able to join my father and get out of Germany. Before we left, we were forced to turn over everything that we owned to the Nazis, and we arrived in Paris with 40 marks for the 4 of us, the equivalent of $40. Within 2 months, World War II broke out, and the French arrested my father because he was a German citizen. So he was again interned. And my mother then placed us in a home for Jewish children run by a Jewish welfare organization. She soon thereafter got a job as a cook in the home. As the Nazis are advancing to Paris, the home was on the route that the army was taking, so we were under heavy bombardment for something like 2 weeks. One of the most terrifying memories that I have, just before the Nazis entered Paris and the French surrendered, the children were evacuated to a home in central France, where our main difficulty living now, really under the Nazis, was that we were always hungry. There was just a limited food. In 1941, the American State Department issued a limited number of visas for Jewish children in French concentration camps. The resistance was unable to get the children out of the concentration camp, and the precious visas were given to the Jewish home. The children chosen to go to America because there weren't enough visas for everybody were given to mainly orphans, but 2 days before they were ready to leave, 2 children got sick, and my sister Ruth and I were given the visas. We were the only ones who could go because my mother and father were there and could sign all the papers. There was an arduous 2 months journey to America. Ruth and I arrived in New York in 1941. And for the next 5 years, I was a foster child in New York, living with 3 different families, not always with my sister. In 1942, my younger sister was hidden in a French convent. My parents were arrested, spent the years of the war in French concentration camps, undergoing some terrible, terrible experiences. Nevertheless, we are an unusual family because in spite of everything, my parents joined us in America in 1946. So we are a nuclear family who survived, which is very rare. Both my grandfathers were murdered, aunts, uncles, cousins. Holocaust left a scar on all of us.
Thank you so much, Eve, for compressing such an incredible story. I really appreciated the amount of traveling and hiding that you went through. Amazing. It's just amazing. I'm so glad.
I did want to understand what it was. I took a lot of time in the beginning. People need to understand what it was like living under the Nazis even before the war.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
May I now transition to Susie in Washington, D.C. Susan, is it Suzanne Bennet? Come and tell us. Your family is quite well known.
I was born a year before the war in Poland, in Warsaw. Again, a middle-class family. My parents were art dealers, and basically most of their clients were diplomats and so forth. And quite a few of them, including several German journalists, warned them that this was coming and that they should get out as fast as they could. My father simply could not comprehend that the Germans, many of whom he knew from graduate school and other places, could possibly do this. I don't quite understand why they weren't more aware of Kristallnacht, for example, but they weren't.
And this is a very well-known fact about the German Jews, that they were such an integral part of the financial and other parts of the community, they couldn't believe that they were turned against.
After, in 1939, in August, when the Germans came in with bombing raids and so forth, my parents went out to the countryside for a while, then came back, and in 1941, we were pushed into the Warsaw Ghetto, as were 100,000 or more people from the surrounding countryside, and some from places as far away as Ukraine and Russia. The Germans basically wanted to use it as an extermination camp without calling it that. So the caloric allowance for each adult was between 125 and 150 calories a day. People became very ill. Many starved to death. There was a great deal of smuggling, mostly done by small children who would be sent out through the wall to bring in food, and many of them were caught and shot right on the street. In 1943, my parents realized finally that they should do something about trying to save themselves. It was a time when the rest of the family, who had mostly been sent out to work in factories, were scooped up out of the factories, off the street, simply disappeared. It's only much later that we discovered that most of them ended up dying at Treblinka, which was the nearest extermination camp to Warsaw. A few of the leaders of the ghetto committed suicide. rather than cooperate with the Germans, which they had been doing before, in hopes that they would save more people that way.
There were people who gave out cyanide pills so that people could end it if they wanted.
But, you know, there was so much inequality even within the ghetto, because you had the fairly well-to-do middle class, mostly from Warsaw, who managed to bring some things with them and managed to buy food and so forth. And then they were the poor from the shtetls and the countryside who had nothing. When you walked along the street, there were bodies everywhere as the years went by. First, small children and the elderly, and then gradually everybody.
We're kind of halfway through, dear.
My parents managed to smuggle me out through a Polish friend who organized that through a Polish policeman who got me out. And I was fortunately very blonde and very blue-eyed and fairly easy to get me out and have me blend into the population. And I was sent out to the countryside. My mother came out about a few months later. My father was there until the uprising and did not actually join us again until the Russians came in at the end of the war. We then traveled again through friends of my parents from before the war to Sweden for 4 years, traveled all over Europe, to Mexico, and eventually New York City. I was class of 55 at Hunter. I went on to college and graduate school in the United States. My parents started up their business again. Unfortunately, a number of their diplomatic clients showed up with some of them returning things that they had given them before the war. And my mother wrote a small diary at one point in the early 70s, and she said at the beginning that it was for my children, her grandchildren, but she didn't want to put any of the awful things in it. I read it the other day, and she completely skips over the period in the ghetto. She simply couldn't write about that. For years after the war, she would have horrible nightmares, and neither of my parents ever spoke about what had happened at all.
Not easy to talk to children about this.
My daughter started, when she was taking an ethics course in high school, finally got my mother to talk about it a little bit, but not much. My father never did. When he died, we thought he had Alzheimer's, but the autopsy showed that he had terrible damage in his brain, the CTE, the type of thing that football players get. And it became obvious that during the war, he had been very badly beaten on a number of occasions. And had, again, never, ever told us about any of it. Never even told my mother. But we survived, and we came here, and I have a wonderful family. I've had a terrific education, starting at Hunter, and a wonderful life.
You know, my father, when I first complained about income tax, I said, Dad, I was working part-time at Basic Books on 4th Avenue. He said, this is a free country. You're getting a free education there. You can say whatever you want to. Pay your taxes. He was so loyal.
I remember my father having exactly the same. He once said he was very happy to pay taxes because of all that America had done for us.
Yes, that's so wonderful. Can I transition now to someone who came from Poland also, and who's quite a woman, Joan Finkelstein. Your background is science, isn't it?
Yes.
Can you tell us how you got here?
Well, that was long before science. And I was Joan Kent, class of 54, 6 very good years winter that started me off on many good things. The story I want to tell you started really before I was born. And it's a very different story than either Eve or Susie's or Lisa's, in that we left Poland when I was 3 in 1940, and I'll give you the background in a moment, and arrived in New York City in February of 41. So that basically we missed direct exposure to much of the horrors that went on during the war. That is not to say they didn't touch us in many ways, but we were not there. My story really begins before I was born in 1935, because I have wondered, when does a journey really begin? What makes people go or stay? My family was in Warsaw. My family were professional people. My father was an engineer and my mother a literary critic. They had large families in Warsaw and were basically rather happy with their lives there. But in 1935, my father took a trip to Paris, and he had to take trains in Berlin. Big layover, 3 hours. And how could you sit still for 3 hours? So he went for a walk and he came upon a parade of goose-stepping soldiers in uniform at a time when information is not what it is now. And as he watched that, a car came around the corner, an open car, became much better known later, with a man in it. And the man was Hitler. And their eyes met, and he would tell us how it was like a metaphysical shock. It was a shock of personality. He looked into this man's face and he thought, this man is dead. Who is this man? And so he bought a copy of Mein Kampf, got back on the train, had a good time at the Folies Bergère in Paris, but read Mein Kampf carefully. And as he returned by train to Warsaw, I guess with a shorter stopover in Berlin, he met my mother and he said, we have to leave, as he handed her Mein Kampf, but she didn't want to go. So from 35 on, there was a question of what to do and why. But in 1936, when Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland, my father said, that's it. Went to the American embassy and found out about the quota, which was small for Poland and full 50 years ahead. So he went to London. He could get a visa to England, but he couldn't get a work permit. And he reasoned, if he went to London and met some people there as an engineer, perhaps they would sponsor him for a work permit. So as an educated Polish Jew, all of whom were quite multilingual, he got a copy of Pickwick Papers and a dictionary and taught himself enough English that he then went to England and went to Marconi College in Chelmsford, England, where radar was being worked on, and as we learned later, was a home for MI5 and MI6. They didn't get him a visa, but there were people who remembered him and tracked us down in New York in 1943 through the Red Cross. We would not have been alive any longer if we'd still stayed in Poland, but they did try to get him out. He came back, and life was rather pleasant. The news was alarming. The economic situation was grim, but it was pretty pleasant until the 1st of September, and with troops, tanks, and planes, on the pretext of provocation, Hitler came into Poland and attacked it. My father was a lieutenant in the Polish army, as having an advanced education, and went out to fight. And by the time he came back 4 weeks later, Poland had surrendered. And there we were, under German occupation. When I look back on it and remember my father's stories and my mother's stories, it's striking how quickly the lessons the Germans, the Nazis had learned in Germany, in Austria, and in Czechoslovakia were applied. And as Susie has indicated, but the knowledge I had from stories my parents told were how so many privileges of daily life and citizenship were immediately removed. And ration cards were given out very quickly. Only German citizens or Volksdeutsch, people of the German folk who were Polish only because of border changes after World War I, had more or less normal calories. Poles had less, and Jews from the very beginning had even less.
We're halfway through, my darling.
And
I'm
still in
hungry.
Poland. I'm
Yeah.
still in Poland. We finally decided to leave because my nanny came back from Christmas in Germany and said to my mother, "You've got to leave." So they found this time news was by word of mouth. They found a travel agency that refused to go out of business and that had found a corrupt Gestapo official in Krakow. That was difficult to maneuver, but through that, they managed to get exit permits from Poland, transit permits through Italy, and we packed and finally left in mid-April of 1940. We were the last to leave through this particular travel agency because the courier was late to the office, having met a very conversational woman he knew. And in the meantime, the Nazis raided the agency and everyone was never heard from again. He walked across the city and said, "Go." And we left the next morning by train. And we went to Italy, to Trieste, where we stayed for a few months, living with Sicilian factory workers who offered us salvation in Sicily, to which they said the war would never come. But my father refused. He didn't like the climate. And through the aid of Jewish organizations like the American Joint Distribution Committee, Jewish Agency, the Italians were very well organized, the Jewish agencies, and the Italians basically were very interested in people and family and had a totally different and very positive attitude. And finally,
Didn't we come to the States at a similar age?
we did. But these stories are stories that were told to me. I can't say I remember them. I think of my recollections as my life as told to me. But because I had come from a family of storytellers, and because these stories were really stories of resilience and luck, they told them. The stories of what happened to the rest of the family in Warsaw, none of whom survived, did not come out at that time. They came out much later. But we got to Turkey through the Jewish agencies. We left Italy the day Mussolini went to war, and we spent 6 months in Turkey, which was another culture to get used to, another life to lead. And then eventually we got out through introductions by train and went to Baghdad and lived in Baghdad for a while, a combination of modern and medieval, and not many Jews and not many Jewish agencies. But we went to Basra and took a boat down the Persian Gulf, where we spent Christmas in a really Dickensian English Christmas, for which I still have the menu with roast goods. In December of 1940, when Europe had fallen, we were on this British boat on our way to India. Now, the problem was that we had gotten American visas in Istanbul. My father's application in 1936 finally came through, I think because most people on the list were not anywhere near accessible, if still alive. And so there we were in India. We had 3 months to get on American soil or the American immigration visas would expire. This was a problem in 1940, but somehow we got on a ship. We got on a ship that spent the biblical 40 days going around South Africa to New York, and we were headed for San Francisco, which we were told was really heaven on earth. But my mother persuaded my father to stop off and sightsee in New York because we'd never come back. And we ended up on the Upper West Side. And it's not that we never came back, we never left. So we were very fortunate. A lot of people helped us along. We got visas at the right time. When we got on the American ship, we were very close to the expiration of the visas, but a ship flying the American flag is American soil. So we had arrived.
You know, you said some things that were common to each of us, and that was we were very lucky and we were very resilient. No matter how many countries we had to go to, no matter how much we had to live through, we were resilient and,
Well,
and
things
we
changed.
survived.
Things changed and we really had to adapt. We had to adapt to cultures, to languages, to what was acceptable. India was different from Baghdad and certainly from Istanbul. And when we came, we were also fortunate in that there were many people who helped us. The American Jewish Joint Committee, which had helped us to leave Poland and helped us along the way. Introductions. My father, as an engineer, was able to find a job. My mother, as a literary critic, no matter what her language was difficult, you leave your language and your culture much more behind you. And I went to school and really grew up as an American. But coming here at the age of 4, as you did, but later, in an American culture, I always felt I grew up with double vision. There was the culture I knew from home and the somewhat different one that I encountered in the streets, in the schools, and among my friends. And I think that's not a bad thing for us in this day and age.
It's not a bad thing, and especially if you're not embarrassed by your previous history and struggles. Because America seemed to me such a positive place in the 1950s, 40s and 50s.
Well, in the 40s, certainly. And in the 40s, when so many of the men were away, my mother would comment how the women were really resilient, how many people came and helped us get settled, helped suggest schools, helped suggest things to do. There was a great deal of positive spirit. There was very little competition and a lot of help, even if you were an engineer at a time when Jewish engineers were very rare in this country.
There's some people in the audience who really wanted to know how much we shared, if at all, at Hunter. If we connected with each other, if we told each other about this. And I wonder if, Raymond, who is it that's going to deal with the questions from the audience?
That would be Caitlin.
Caitlin, would you like to ask some of the questions that our audience who wants to hear about, and our panelists will answer?
Sure. So the first question that we received is from Michelle. And the question was, do you see any parallels to what is going on here now?
Wow.
I could do an hour and a half.
That's right. I think each of us would like to respond to that. Susie, can you take that one first?
There are too many parallels, I'm afraid. If you look around the whole world, we have not learned our lesson. We're not really, fascism has come back to Poland, for example. I had thought of traveling back to Poland to see friends of my parents, and now I never would, because they're completely changing the history of what actually happened between the Poles and the Jews. And if you say that there were Poles who turned Jews in, you end up in prison at this point in Poland.
Eve, would you like to take it from there? No, the relevance now.
Well, I think that people in the world have not learned to stop killing each other. That's putting it very bluntly, because there are problems in Myanmar, in China, in Africa. Plus, we're one particular religious or ethnic group, substitute for the Jews, is now being murdered and killed. Plus, going back to the Holocaust, anti-Semitism continues to exist. Unfortunately, the advance of the internet has made it easy to spread hatred among Jews. And this is true in America. It's true in England, where I live. It's true in France. The Jews are still the scapegoats.
Can I
We
just,
somehow haven't learned. And the reason that we tell our stories is to just keep pleading with people. This is what happened in the Holocaust. And if you don't learn from us, it's going to get worse and it's going to happen again.
may I just interject an opinion that probably is not welcome by everybody? It's very different to come into a town in Africa or wherever and shoot people, as opposed to shoving them into a crematorium. It's a different concept. It's a different way of thinking. And that's what fascism is. So that's why I'm so pleased that there's so many people who are interested in this. So, Joan, do you want to take it from here?
Well, I think what you voted is something that's very apparent and very clear to those of us who lived through it, and probably to many of you alumni who are here. But we have a great many groups that are being scapegoated here. They vary from time to time, but they are scapegoats, and they are pushed to the side, and they are not given jobs, and the children are not encouraged in school. All the things that we have referred to that has made us so happy to be here are limited in their scope. And that's something that I think those of us who are speaking are well aware of and see how it affects other people as well, and have tried to do our share to try to limit the hatred and the invective and the acts against others of other groups.
But being aware is really important. There were elements of everyone's story where people resisted the reality. And I guess we just have to be aware if any of that is on its way to us.
I must say, I worry very much about the fact that civics and history are not really
Right.
taught anymore to the extent that they were when we were in high school. And people are unaware of the repetitive quality, really, of horrors everywhere.
That's what I was going to refer to, really. But we are very much more an ahistoric country than many older countries in this world. And we did have a lot of civics, certainly in New York City, which I think were very important. But the history that we learn is a kind of history that de-emphasizes this, the issues that have arisen and that came and went.
Caitlin, do you have another question from an attendee?
The next question is from Leslie Luxembourg. And the question is that it would be fascinating to hear how you ended up at Hunter.
Well, we were in, I was in a junior high school. The test was offered to people who had certain qualifications, and 2 people from my class passed, and we went. It was even in those days, it was a school that everybody wanted to go to. And the fact that we had to travel long distances, many of us, it would take me a good hour to get there. It didn't make any difference. Why would anybody not want to end up at Hunter if there's an opportunity?
I was a little immigrant girl with someone called Dr. Berger, and he saw that I was pretty bored at school. And he told my mom about Hunter. And that's how I applied. It was very nice of him to do. I have to say that it made such a difference in my life and my approach.
I think that's true for almost all of us.
Yeah.
With a group of people with whom we have had and continue to have many commonalities. And my mother heard about Hunter from other mothers in the playground. And that was part of the way that people helped us. And then again, the school, as Eve has said, suggested some of us take it. From my school also, for 7th grade, 2 of us went and stayed all the way through. How about you, Susie?
I came here through Mexico, where I went to 7th grade at the American school and learned English and Spanish. And when we came here, my parents had no idea about American schools at all. And I wandered around the neighborhood. We were living at 56th Street off 5th and came across PS 59 and went. And we had some terrific teachers. And somebody just suggested Hunter. I went and looked at Hunter. Again, my parents didn't know about schools. I didn't even realize how lucky I was at the time that I did well on the test and got in. It just seems sort of like a natural progression at that point. And
It really has helped me to speak out on many subjects, including this one. Caitlin, do we have another question?
The next question is from Leslie Hasberg, and she asks, does your history inform your political ideas, activism, and support for immigrants and asylum seekers in particular?
Wow, wow, wow. Why don't we go right to Joan for this one?
Having grown up here, grown up in the light of the stories I had heard growing up, certainly I was aware of many things. I never became a political activist, but it certainly made me very interested in and eager to be of help to immigrants, to help them get accustomed to the way people were living here, to the kinds of opportunities that there were. We didn't always have teachers who said, how about Hunter? There are many, many things to learn. So I think the awareness that people did things differently and that was okay, that people could accommodate to learning and behave as they wished, but needed to know about our life and country was there. And that being a citizen, we've spoken about taxes, and voting also was always indicated to me, and I tried to indicate to other people, was very, very important. And to try to see what were the issues that were arising, which was not always easy to see. So
Eve, would you like to take it from here, love? Eve?
Oh, well, I think that I was always aware that I was an immigrant. Going back, one of the things about coming to Hunter is I got away from my neighborhood, and I could just be like everybody else and not really share anything with anybody. But I was always totally aware of immigrant. In those days, you had to be 21 in order to become a citizen. I had to do it on my own because my parents came much later, so I couldn't go with them. So I was not an American citizen until I was 21. I greatly valued my American citizenship, but to the extent that even though I've lived in England for 30 years, I've never given up my American citizenship. Having become an American has made me, I was always very aware, and I was always aware that there was a certain freedom in America, and it was important to preserve that. I actually became involved in local politics. I became involved in certain issues. I remember particularly being active in trying to get the Equal Rights for Women amendment passed in the Constitution.
No, that's a very important topic. That was a very important topic. May I interject that my citizenship ceremony was so important to me. I was so proud when I became a citizen. How about you, Susie.
I had learned during the war to hide and to keep my head down and not to pop up in public at all. It took me a long time to become more active, to go to a few marches, because my husband was in the government for many, many years. I was sort of willy-nilly thrust into that life. But there was always this view on the part of my parents, which was translated to me, that you don't stand out, you don't pop up and say who you are. I think that's one reason that during my hunter years, I never ever talked about my background, and I never knew that there were other Holocaust survivors in the class. Once I hit college, Wellesley was not exactly full of shrinking violets. And I did get involved in a lot of things. And over the years, I've worked with immigrants. I've taught. When I retired, I started to teach English as a second language, mostly to Hispanics, since I knew Spanish from my year in Mexico. But I always have this feeling that I shouldn't draw attention to myself. And that's, I think, a leftover from my childhood and from the years that I spent hiding as a little blonde, blue-eyed, pseudo-Polish girl in the countryside.
You could also pose as a German. You would.
Well, I was lucky I didn't, because the
Multinational.
Germans actually took quite a few children who looked like German children should look, as far as they were concerned, to Germany and turn them into good little Germans.
May I ask a question that, I mean, has affected me a great deal? What emotional issues are with you now that you can attribute to the Holocaust? How you view things, whether it's confidence or depression or a view of the world. The psychologists say that trauma, very young, tends to stay with you somehow and influence your thinking. Is that so for you, Eve, for instance?
One of the things is I always believed that I had to do the right thing, not the safe thing, but the right thing. That there were things which are wrong. Go back to the 10 Commandments, if you like, just that you need to be kind, respectful of other people, that you had to advance to try to do for yourself and always to help others, because I felt that I was lucky to survive. I said in my talk that I replaced another child who should have come. I don't know, because that child got sick. And I always felt that I had to live and do the right thing and contribute because I had had this opportunity. And it's to some extent with me to this day, to just try and be active, to try and help others when I can, to try to be respectful, to do my best.
Joan?
Well, I would agree with that. And I would say that looking back on values that came from my family growing up here, among them were character, which I was to be solely responsible for, and education. And that involved realizing how lucky it was to be where I was and living the life I was, and doing the right thing. That was character. It wasn't always comfortable, and I can't say I always did it exactly right, but it was clear that was how it should be. And responsibility that Eve talked about, absolutely. Other people are in trouble, do something, reach out, acknowledge it, try to help. So I think a feeling of responsibility for the world in a sense, but certainly for other people, comes with it, and feeling very lucky. And you talked, Lisa, about this country in the 40s and 50s. I remember my father discussing how when they first came here in the early 40s, America was not yet in the war. It was before Pearl Harbor. And he would walk down 34th Street. Somebody was unpacking a truck and had left some boxes there while he went to get a container to put them in, to take them into Macy's or something. And he stood there and watched for 15 minutes as people walked by. Nobody stole a box. Nobody gave a second look at the box. He said this was really an event for him. He could not imagine this in so many of the places that we had been through or he had lived.
Yes,
his 40
outstanding.
years.
Yeah, that's true.
And that made such an impression on him. And he sometimes contrasted that with an occasion during our time in Warsaw, when the Germans came to his parents' apartment and confiscated some art that his parents had. His aunt had sent his parents some Rodin sculptures, and they confiscated them. And they gave a detailed receipt written up as if by an art critic. And they took them and they left the receipt. And he realized before very long that his parents were known to the Germans to be destined for extermination, but they still did this charade. And that was so infuriating to him compared to what he saw as the integrity and straightforwardness he found here. And among the first Americans he met when we lived in Istanbul, when he taught at Robert College, that was an American school founded by American missionaries. It was a different world, and we were responsible for keeping it that way.
Yeah. Suzanne, character.
Character is something that I tried very hard to inculcate in my children, and I think I was pretty successful. And they have made much more of a contribution to the good things that are happening.
May I say that
now.
that one of your sons is a senator from Colorado, and another used to be, I don't know what he's doing now, used to be in charge of the editorial section of the New York Times. I don't know what he's doing now, but you certainly were successful.
And my daughter has been very active in the business world, oddly enough, as opposed to government and journalism the way the boys have. And I'm enormously proud of them. And I see my grandchildren, the oldest of whom is 20, and is following along, being very active in, for example, this past year in getting people to sign up to vote and helping voters in general and so forth.
Yeah.
So the next generation is stepping up.
Yes.
We've all heard about a book that said it takes a village, but I think we can also contribute that it takes a generation.
Well, I think I love the Jewish tradition of justice and compassion. I find that it comes from my family, not just, from being an American. That was very, very important. As a young girl, and looking for a husband, so to speak, or of age, I did marry a doctor, but my parents would have been as happy, if not happier, if he had been a teacher or a professor. That knowledge would have, it was very, very important.
Education itself is the key to everything.
Yeah. So I married a doctor, but it didn't impress them as much as I thought it would. Caitlin, do you have any more questions?
The next question is from Mona Deutsch-Miller, and this question is specifically for Eve Kugler. She says, I'd like to ask Ms. Kugler if the British approach to immigrants and assimilation was different from the American approach.
I really, it's complicated. I don't know that I want to go into the politics of America and Great Britain.
So the next question is from Meryl.
Sorry.
The next question is from Meryl Kravitz, and she asks, have your children or grandchildren experienced third-generation trauma? This has only fairly recently been acknowledged.
How about you, Joan? What do you think?
I came here very young. I had many good experiences. Undoubtedly, there is trauma, as in all of us. I think my children are very fortunate to have grown up here when and where they did. I think they are more historically aware than they might otherwise have been. I did marry an American. I sometimes tell him he Americanized me. I had never gone to lots of football games and all that sort of thing. That's very common, though not necessarily in Hunter in New York City. But our children certainly were imbued with the idea that they were part of a community and with some historical consciousness. And both of them, we have a son and a daughter. Our son is in science. Our daughter is in social science and economics, are very aware of these things. I wouldn't say it has been the defining feature of their life in any way, but it has been there as a sort of basso continuo, and that's a good thing.
Would they naturally oppose any fascism in this country? Would they naturally stand up for being Jews?
My children.
Yes, of course, your children or anyone
Is
around
that what
you.
you're asking?
Yes.
We were, my son is here. Why don't you ask him?
That's a nice boy.
Well
to
done.
be with his mama at this time in London. What time is it in London?
It's 9:30.
Oh my goodness gracious.
No, we were a very active political family. We were very in my marriage, my first marriage in America, we were very, very involved in politics, and this was a part of just the world of the children. They just assumed and accepted, and they can. My daughter particularly is very involved in politics. To this day, she's very active in getting people out to vote. She makes phone calls. There's a program in Massachusetts that she found where new citizens, when they come out of having gotten their citizenship, she's in a group. She's hands them the opportunity to register. You now can vote. All kinds of things, and also just speaking actively out to people. I'm very proud of the fact that they have taken the views that it is important to be involved and active in making a better world.
Can I just make myself a better world and not get divorced? I remarried after my first husband passed away from pancreatic cancer. So I remarried a wonderful person here who is not a doctor, he's a lawyer. So, you know, I'm still in the fold. I think that he shows me that Americans, especially he came from the South, my husband comes from Roanoke, Virginia, that he is not nearly as involved in Yiddishkeit, in Jewishness, in, I don't know if you find that who of your friends who are Jewish who would not come to this kind of meeting? Do you have people like that who would not find this interesting?
I think that my grandchildren, at least the older ones, are very interested in what happened in the past and what they can do to contribute today. They're definitely, all of them, older ones of an activist mindset. Just voting is one of the things. Volunteering to tutor, that sort of thing. And I think that is part of the Jewish culture, is to reach out to make life better for everyone around them.
Yes, I mean, we were involved in so many different things, including in the South and wherever, you know. I think that the experience from the Holocaust has really, but I don't think that's the only reason that we respond when people are in need and are being misused. And I'm very proud of that, very proud. Caitlin, do we have another question from the audience?
The next question is from Ruth Gordon Randall, and she asks, did you share your memories during the years you were at Hunter, and did you locate classmates with similar memories?
In
I
my
think,
at Hunter, there were a number of us who were obviously of such background, and we knew of that of each other, but it's not something that we particularly discussed. If we shared a common language, we never used it. When we met one another's parents, as we often did in those years, we didn't particularly discuss it. And I think it's quite true that for myself and perhaps some of the others, we were very busy becoming American.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more.
That's what we discussed.
Yeah. Any Russian, any Polish, any Yiddish was eliminated. We were just speaking English all the time.
I must.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I insisted that we continue to speak Polish at home because I didn't want to lose the language. And as a result, one of my sons now comments on my parents' accent as having been impenetrable because they didn't practice enough.
Bardzo dobrze.
And
very good in Polish.
I had the opposite experience. Most of the children of my parents' emigre friends were adamant about speaking only English at home. And I was different because I somehow decided in my immature way that nobody except my parents and their friends understood Polish. And therefore I was free of all constraints of politeness, etc. appropriateness. I could say anything I wanted, anywhere I wanted, if it were Polish, and they did not disabuse me of that idea. So I ended up speaking it and still do.
Did you, Eve, did you want to tell us what you spoke?
As far as, I think the question was, did I share my history at Hunter? I think, was that not the question?
Yes.
And the answer is an absolute categorical no. Most children who, when you come to a new country at a certain age, you can lose your accent. And so nobody ever knew that I wasn't an American. It was very important for me to try to be like everybody else. And I had a double background because I was not only an immigrant and a Holocaust survivor, I was also a foster child. And I hid all of those things. When my parents came, which was in the middle of when I was in Hunter, part of the reason we spoke English a lot is because I had, my sister came when she was 10, she had to learn English. My parents felt that my older sister, who had lived in America during the war, were already American, and the family had to be American. So it was really English. I would also say I think the only person who really knew anything about my history was one friend I had in Hunter, because we became very close. Her mother had died when she was 14. She kind of lived at our house. She knew my mother and my father. She knew about the accent. So she just automatically knew the history, but otherwise, I never talked about it. And the number of survivors in my class, there were 10, 12, whatever. I never knew. I was surprised, and some of it came out at various reunions, and some of it later on, because I run a website which has the histories of survivors who were Hunterites. They contacted me, and it came out that way. But it's just something that I hid and hid and hid.
Do you think, what is the difference of other immigrants who come here? Do they learn English right away? Is there a force behind that?
I'm sorry.
Is there a force behind other immigrants who've come to America to be Americans? Or is it different?
I think one of the things that we have to understand is that most, not Polish, but Western European languages are closer. It's easier to learn English if you start with, I think, with French or with German or with Dutch than it is if you start with an Arabic language where the alphabet is totally different. Everything is so different that I think it's more difficult. Also, somewhere along the way, I don't know when in history, we got to this point where we had to respect and push our own history and our own culture, and people started to form groups of being Swedish, if you will. I picked that out because I don't want to hurt anybody. But in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, there wasn't this emphasis on your history and your background. It was more an emphasis, we're here, we're Americans. And yeah. I think this has changed, and that also changes the attitude. There are official languages in New York City now. There are five different languages that your ballot comes in. So you don't have to be as fluent as you needed to be in order to participate.
I found in teaching English as a second language to mostly Hispanic adults, but also French-speaking Africans and so forth, their children absolutely want to become the interpreters for their parents. They will help their parents with their homework, their English homework. They will come to school with them when they need help with the landlord, whatever, and want to talk to a teacher to get help. They all want to fit in. They all want to speak English without an accent, which is very difficult for adult learners.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, I was through 5 languages by the time I was 12.
Yes.
Which I have pretty much forgotten by now, but in each case, I
The
ended up
younger you
without
are,
any
the
accent
easier.
because I was very young when I learned them.
Much easier when you're young, absolutely.
I think that's true. And I think the more languages you learn, the easier it is for the next one. But I think just going to the playgrounds in New York City, you hear so many languages and you pick up words in other languages.
Oh, yes.
And that's a help in general attitudes towards immigrants or people of other cultures. I think it makes us more open.
Caitlin, we have time for 2 more questions from our attendees.
This is related to what you were just saying. Ayala Jones has asked, what about Yiddish? Wasn't that part of your culture?
Well, do any of you speak Yiddish at all? I do, sort of, kind of.
My mother learned Yiddish when she came to America because she was working in a factory, and the people where she was working all spoke Yiddish, and this is when she first learned Yiddish. Spoke Yiddish.
I think it's because we came from a shtetl outside of Łódź, and Yiddish was a common language to evade the Poles. So we learned that, and we were very happy that it was partly German in origin. You know? So yes, I speak Yiddish. There are people here who publish Yiddish stories, Yiddish music. There's an awful lot of spirit in that. And I'm very glad to be able to speak it. I'm surprised that you were from Poland and didn't learn Yiddish.
My father spoke Yiddish, but he was educated in France, so he spoke French very well. If you were Jewish in Poland, it was very difficult to get into the universities, which had huge quotas. And people went to Germany, they went to Switzerland, they went to France to learn. And most of them were multilingual, which helped after the war, I have to say. But he did speak some Yiddish, but at home, even in his family, they only spoke Polish. So
there's a huge Yiddish culture and literature, et cetera, et cetera. Were you going to say something, Joan?
Well, I think that there were a variety of communities. Susie's family and my family were from Warsaw, and there were a lot of Jews in Warsaw. There was a large percentage of the population, some of whom spoke Yiddish, some of whom didn't. My family were Polish speakers, and educated Poles of their generation spoke a minimum of 4 languages. I mean, there weren't that many people speaking Poland elsewhere, it's like the Dutch and others, so they spoke Polish, Russian, French, and German. And they had a good deal of Latin, and if they were lucky or not, Greek or math in school. But my father, at one point, as an engineer, undertook an independent business dealing with the advent of sound movies. And so he traveled around Poland to all the shtetls, and he was concerned that he did not speak Yiddish. He thought this was a great problem for doing business. And so as part of his business plan, he learned 3 dozen Yiddish jokes. And he said, with that, he did quite well. And he did a very good business. But once you introduced the materials, the equipment for the talkies, the business was over. So the jokes did very well by him.
My father just, and I was going to say, my father, even in his old age, would still have little tags of Latin that he would quote from his days in school. And he described first arriving in Paris and not speaking much French, but all of them had some Latin. And so they would just sort of trade jokes and things in Latin. I never could get, my daughter was willing to study Latin, but I couldn't get the boys to do it. Telling them what a basic language it was, but no such luck. And I'm glad that they made me learn it at Hunter, I have to say.
3 years.
I like that a lot, yes. I think the Yiddish culture has so much life and music and comedy and outgoingness that I hope doesn't get lost. I mean, there are some people who are experts in Yiddish literature and continuing that, but I think it came from the shtetl.
In the Warsaw Ghetto, there was Yiddish theater, Yiddish opera, Yiddish literature. There was one thing that was in common with the people from the shtetl and from the more professional, more European Jews who came from other places. But it was a very, very, I mean, people were dying of hunger around them, and they still managed to have theater.
Yeah.
It was amazing.
It still happens. Caitlin, I think we're ready for our last question.
The last question is from Jane Tucker.
Thank you. I've been having a terrible time trying to get it posted, and I actually had sent the question in advance. My question is, two parts. How old were you when you first learned English? And in what language do you dream?
Ooh.
Well, I
Well,
can tell you, I was 11 when I learned English, and I was 12 when I came to the United States.
I was four
And
and a
I,
half
at
when I
that
learned
point, I
English.
was dreaming in Swedish. So there you are, back to Sweden. Now I
came
dream in
off the-
English.
I came off the boat, they say, dancing and singing in 3 languages, and I was very happy. I had my first taste of chocolate. I had, my mom was in the birth not so well with her tummy, and I was the happiest girl on earth coming off the boat. So what do you have to say about this, Eve? Did you want to address this?
It's very simple. I came to this country. I worked very, very hard to forget the German language, to forget everything that was German, very determined to have nothing to do with Germans. And I dream in English to this day. I think in English. German is a struggle. I had to relearn German, but the question was dream in English, think in English. That's it.
I was 4 when I came, and English was about to become my 3rd language. I was sent to a nursery school where there was only one other child who spoke Polish. And I'm told that I just sat around saying nothing, only time in my life, for about a month, and then started speaking in complete sentences in English. So that was the 3rd language, and I've been speaking that ever since. The second was Turkish, and I've forgotten that.
The first time I ever dreamed in another language, it was Hebrew. I had learned enough for it to transmit to dreaming. It was amazing. I was stunned, and I was very happy about that. It proved that it had really become something for me. Joan, we talked. Susie.
I
Did
just
you
want
want
to
to-
thank everybody, by the way, for coming and to hear us. It's very important to all of us that people understand what the Holocaust was and not to repeat the terrible things that happened to all of us.
Bravo. I think you would second that too, wouldn't you, Joan?
Absolutely, but I would also add that I carry away from Hunter, among many other good things, that it was basically a very friendly place. Many of us were Jewish, more than I realized at the time, were Holocaust survivors. But I had at least, I think all of us had a great deal of interaction with people from other backgrounds. And that's something that we carried with us, and that is important, and that in this context can only help us deal with more people in ways that we believe are good.
We didn't want to address any politics in this discussion. And I think we would like very much to thank people who want to understand what fascism is, and to be sure to recognize it and maybe to oppose it.
Can I just jump in to say you 4 have been so wonderful, but you've been too busy probably to reach the chat. And in the chat, all of us are sending our great gratitude and thanks to you for sharing your stories. And all of us have said how wonderful it is, but you've been so busy sharing the stories that you probably haven't read the wonderful chat.
Well, thank you for chatting with us. We will certainly all read.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
And that was my daughter-in-law
Oh,
from Arkansas, and definitely not
Arkansas.
I would like to
our
say,
backgrounds.
Yes,
I would like to say that my mother, who lived to be 96, and with whom I co-authored a book, was adamant that the Holocaust has to be remembered. She said all the time, people have to know what happened. so that it is repeated again. I think that we must never, ever forget what happened to the Holocaust and all the things that we've discussed, the terrible things that resulted from the Holocaust. And I hope that the people who came today have gotten some sense of this, and I hope that they will share with their friends and their families what they have heard from us today.
The only thing I wanted to say was there are historical facts, but it's individual experience that penetrates, that makes you remember. It's not just a fact, it's a happening to so many people. To teach kids in school that 6 million people were killed, it's true that it's a large number, but it doesn't hit home until you know what it's done to people. So I wanted to thank the panelists very much for opening their hearts to us, and to thank you very much for going through some stuff that's very difficult and some very happy stuff. Do you want to close this, Caitlin, or?
Raymond, since you introduced us.
Yeah, so this is Raymond. I'd like to thank the panelists and the speakers for putting on this just wonderful event. I just wanted, again, just a couple of quick housekeeping things. I will be sharing the chat with all of the speakers afterwards, since they probably haven't had a chance to go through it. So if there's any last comments or things that you wanted to put in there. I think some people put in their contact information as well, so we'll be sharing that.
May I,
Yes.
speaking of contact information, I promised Eve that I would mention anyone out there who would like to join Eve's organization, please put that in your chat message to Eve. We would love to have you as part of the group. Okay,
Yes.
sorry.
No, and also all of you that registered, thank you for attending. You should be receiving a survey shortly after the event. I hope you'll fill that out so that we can continue to improve these events going forward. And I was just chatting with Eve last night, and she mentioned that there are probably 2 times where if there was interest, where we could have events on an annual basis, probably sometime in January, and again, potentially in April. Is that correct, Eve? Yeah. So
Is that January and April, Eve?
Well, Holocaust Remembrance Day, and of course, Yom HaShoah, the Remembrance Day, there were 2.
Raymond, could you also send us the link to Eve's organization, please?
yes, so we'll follow up with the speakers as well, and any information that they would like to send out to the attendees, we'll be glad to send out. I mean, I think this is just a wonderful way for us to be able to build community and to connect with each other, across the generations. We have attendees here from the 40s, I think, all the way through 2010 or the mid 2000s. So yeah, this has just been a wonderful event, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
All right, good night.
Stay safe and well,
yeah,
everyone.
yeah, everybody stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.